New ecosystems rarely begin with brilliance. A coastline shifts, an island rises, ash cools. In the early 1970s, something similar began inside circuitry. Into this unsettled landscape came one of the first digital organisms, Atari. By 1982, Atari had become one of the dominant forces in this digital biome, not because everything was thriving, but because it kept moving forward, even when the environment felt unbalanced. The Atari 2600 introduced traits that would shape future species: programmable hardware, interchangeable cartridges, and one system capable of hosting many different games. To understand how this creature evolved, we return to its earliest ancestor. At the University of Utah, engineering student Nolan Bushnell discovered a game called Space War. By today's standards, it was simple: points of light drifting across a dark screen, running on a machine the size of a room. But Bushnell sensed a spark, not a blazing breakthrough, but a small, promising signal that could be shaped and slowly built into something more. At the same time, he worked at an amusement park, watching people the way a field researcher watches animals. Simple rides held attention. Short experiences kept visitors returning. These weren't moments of joy overflowing. They were predictable patterns, reliable behaviors. And they suggested that electronic entertainment could work the same way. Soon after, Ted Dabney joined him. Bushnell had the idea. Dabney had the steady, methodical approach needed to make it real. The challenge was enormous. Games required room-sized computers. Too big, too costly, too slow to spread. Dabney created the spot motion circuit, shrinking the hardware needed to run a game. It wasn't a dramatic leap. It was a careful adaptation that allowed electronic entertainment to move into bars, bowling alleys, and pizza parlors. These were crowded habitats where attention was scarce and survival depended on proving value quickly. Their first creation was Computer Space, advanced but poorly adapted. The controls were difficult. The experience required effort. Most players drifted away. The creature wasn't ready for this environment. Then came Pong. 2 paddles, 1 square ball, a simple sound, not flashy, but clear. Understandable, a signal that didn't overwhelm or confuse. People grasped it immediately. Coin slots were filled, orders increased. By 1974, thousands of machines were running across the country. Video games entered public life, not through emotional excitement, but through steady, repeatable interaction. A new behavior was forming, but it wasn't just joyful. It was habitual. Growth continued, but strain followed. An overseas expansion failed. Grand Track 10 ran into manufacturing problems that drove up costs. Money tightened. The company shrank. Half the workforce were laid off. Behind the scenes, pressure had been building for a long time. The organism was working harder than the environment could support. A new adaptation followed. Tank. 2 players, 2 tanks, 1 maze. It tapped into a natural instinct: competition. Revenue returned. Stability followed, but only temporarily. Inside Atari, the environment moved quickly, but the work itself was slow and constant. No strict schedules, no heavy structure. Ideas spread like signals through a busy colony. Between 1972 and 1975, about 120 games were created, not through bursts of inspiration, but through continuous effort and feedback between teams, machines, and audiences. During this time, future tech figures like Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak passed through the habitat. They didn't define its direction, but they added to the momentum shaping the system. Meanwhile, the larger environment shifted again. People wanted games at home, Home Pong found modest success. Then came a major evolutionary step, the microprocessor. Hardware that once required complex wiring could now be handled by a single chip, not a sudden miracle, but a tool that made slow, steady growth possible. Bushnell saw the next step clearly. If games could be programmed instead of hardwired, one machine could host many experiences. One system, many games. This idea became the video computer system, the Atari 2600. But building something that large required more resources. In 1976, Warner Communications bought Atari for $28 million and invested another $100 million. The Atari VCS was ready for the market. And now the system was about to shift again, not with bright optimism, but with the weight of an environment that was growing faster than it could balance itself. In nature, when a species gains an advantage before its rivals, the results can reshape an entire habitat. For a while, that advantage seems unstoppable. In 1977, Atari entered exactly that kind of moment. To strengthen its foothold, Atari formed an exclusive partnership with Sears, one of America's largest retailers. The strategy worked. During its first holiday season, roughly 150,000 units migrated into homes across the country. By 1980, more than 2 million Atari 2600 consoles had settled into living rooms, dens, and bedrooms across the ecosystem. By 1982, Atari had become one of the most successful organisms in the corporate world. Sales had reached extraordinary levels. The company generated billions in revenue. At its peak, Atari was valued at approximately $452 million and produced more than 70% of the income for its parent company, Warner Communications. But ecosystems rarely allow success without introducing new pressures. The first signs appeared not in sales, but in culture. Before Warner's acquisition, Atari had evolved under unusually loose conditions. Engineers experimented constantly, letting creativity act as a natural selection process. Warner was a different kind of organism. It valued schedules, forecasts, reporting structures, and quarterly targets. Its survival strategy relied on order rather than on improvisation. When the two species merged, conflict became inevitable. Inside Atari headquarters, engineers debated gameplay mechanics late into the night. Elsewhere, executives reviewed profit margins and growth projections. The friction grew, and eventually the ecosystem lost one of its most important inhabitants. By 1978, Nolan Bushnell departed the company he had helped create. The founder who had recognized the earliest signals of electronic entertainment was gone. Inside the vacant leadership role stepped Ray Kazar. Unlike Bushnell, Kazar came from a traditional corporate background. His experience was in textiles and in large-scale management rather than arcade innovation. His arrival marked a new evolutionary strategy. Under Kazar, Atari became more structured and predictable. Marketing expanded. Development teams shrank. The center of gravity shifted from discovery to efficiency. The goal was no longer just to create the next breakthrough, it was to sell the current one more effectively. And in the short term, the strategy worked. Atari sales surged from approximately $75 million in 1977 to more than $2.2 billion by 1980. Few organisms in business history had ever grown so quickly. But rapid growth can hide vulnerabilities. Inside Atari, turnover accelerated. Many of the individuals who had shaped the species no longer felt at home within it. One by one, original innovators departed, including Al Alcorn, whose simple tennis exercise had evolved into Pong. The losses weren't just personal. The company was shedding institutional memory, the instincts and knowledge that had helped it thrive in its early years. Another tension was rising beneath the surface: recognition. The programmers responsible for Atari's most successful games remain largely invisible to the public. Their creations generated millions, yet their names rarely appeared anywhere consumers could see. There were no royalties, no public credit, no visible acknowledgement. Meanwhile, in other Warner divisions, actors, musicians, and directors received both recognition and financial rewards. To many developers, the contrast was impossible to ignore. Eventually, frustration reached a breaking point. Four of Atari's most talented designers made a decisive move. Rather than continue competing within Atari's hierarchy, they formed a separate colony. A new species. They called it Activision. Activision produced some of the most popular titles available for the Atari 2600. It represented a major evolutionary breakthrough. For the first time, a company was successfully creating software for another company's hardware platform. Today, this arrangement is normal. At the time, it was revolutionary. Activision had created a third-party developer model. And for Atari, the implications were significant. The Atari 2600 itself generated modest profits, sometimes sold close to cost. The real revenue came from software. The expectation was simple: sell consoles, then profit from game sales. Now another organism had discovered how to feed from the same revenue stream. By 1982, Activision had become the fastest-growing video game business in the United States, generating approximately $150 million in annual sales. Atari responded defensively. The dominant species attempted to protect its territory through legal action, filing a lawsuit to block Activision's games. It became one of the industry's first major territorial disputes. But the outcome did not restore Atari's control. The case ended in a settlement in 1982. Activision could continue producing games, it simply had to pay royalties. The challenger survived, and more importantly, it proved that Atari's ecosystem was no longer fully under Atari's control. New organisms were learning how to thrive within it. At first, this looked like a sign of strength. Healthy ecosystems often attract diversity. But diversity can become overcrowding, and overcrowding can become instability. And the signals of coming trouble were beginning to appear. Cartridges flooded the market. New publishers appeared almost overnight. Quality control weakened. After the careful balance that had supported Atari's dominance began to deteriorate, soon the ecosystem was overflowing. Consumers faced an endless stream of brightly colored packaging. Some reliable, many not. Even unexpected organisms entered the habitat. Quaker oats, a species known for breakfast cereal, began producing video games. K-Tel followed, repackaging obscure or underperforming titles and pushing them back into circulation. Volume became the strategy. Whether the games were enjoyable became secondary. In the wild, when too many species imitate the same bright signals, confusion spreads. Consumers began noticing the gap between appearance and reality. Parents grew cautious. Players grew skeptical. Retailers reduced inventory or abandoned video games entirely. The habitat was losing trust in its own signals. Yet instead of slowing production, the industry accelerated. Deadlines replaced refinement. Holiday seasons dictated survival. Products were pushed into the environment faster, sometimes before they were fully developed. Then came a major signal. Atari secured the rights to Pac-Man, the most successful arcade organism on Earth. The adaptation was assigned to a single programmer. The Atari 2600's limited resources forced compromises. When the game emerged, players noticed flickering graphics, altered colors, and slower movement. The organism looked familiar, but something essential had been lost. Atari expected to sell 12 million copies. Roughly 7 million sold, a number impressive on its own, but far below expectations. Trust weakened further. Atari did not learn from its mistake. Atari secured the rights to E.T., the Extraterrestrial, one of the year's biggest films. But time was scarce. A single developer was given about 6 weeks to design, build, test, and finalize the game. It was like forcing an organism to mature. Before it had fully developed, the result entered the habitat with severe weaknesses, confusing gameplay, repetitive mechanics, and frustrating design. Players often found themselves trapped in pits, repeating the same actions. The ecosystem responded with rejection. Returns piled up. Retailers shipped unsold inventory back to Atari. Warehouses filled. Confidence eroded. Eventually, Atari faced an unusual problem: more inventory than the habitat could absorb. As a result, this next event would become legendary. In September 1983, truckloads of unsold cartridges were transported to a landfill in New Mexico. An estimated 700,000 to 728,000 units were buried beneath the desert. Not only E.T., but other overproduced titles as well. For years, the story sounded mythical. Then in 2014, excavators uncovered the cartridges exactly where they had been left. A fossil bed of a technological civilization burying part of its own history. But the burial was only a symptom. The real collapse was underway. By 1983, the American video game ecosystem began to fail. Sales declined sharply. Retailers slashed prices. Store shelves were cleared. In Japan, observers gave the phenomenon a name: Atari shock. Elsewhere, Europe, Canada, Japan, the ecosystem remained more resilient. But in the United States, confidence collapsed. Oversupply, weak quality control, market saturation, and highly visible failures converged at the same moment. The crash lasted roughly 2 years. Companies vanished. Manufacturers folded. Demand had increased by about 100%. Production increased by roughly 175%. By 1982, around 30 million consoles had been sold in the United States, in a country with 35 million households with children aged 6 to 16. Then came another weakness: the Atari 5200. More powerful, but expensive. Its analog controllers frustrated players. The joysticks often failed to return to center, and the system was not fully compatible with the Atari 2600's enormous library. Consumers hesitated. Confusion spread. Environmental conditions worsened. A recession reduced consumer spending. Home computers, IBM, Commodore, Texas Instruments, Coleco entered the habitat, offering multiple functions and justifying their cost as practical investments. Price wars erupted. Migration increased. Atari's share of the cartridge market fell from roughly 75% in 1981 to below 40% in 1982. By mid-1983, Atari reported losses of $356 million. 30% of its workforce was eliminated. Manufacturing moved overseas. Losses exceeded $536 million by year's end. The species that once sustained Warner Communications was now endangering it. In July 1984, Warner made its decision. Atari's consumer division was sold to Jack Tramiel, former head of Commodore International. The organization became Atari Corporation, shifting its focus toward personal computers and the Atari ST line. The age of Atari's unquestioned dominance had ended. The ecosystem it once ruled had been permanently transformed. Yet nature rarely tolerates an empty niche for long. When one apex species declines, another rises to occupy the space. In the mid-1980s, a new organism was preparing to take control: Nintendo. Nintendo studied the collapse carefully. It built stronger communication systems directly into its ecosystem. Every NES contained a proprietary lockout chip. Every licensed cartridge contained a matching key. If the signals failed to match, the game would not function. After years of disappointing products, it introduced the official Nintendo seal of quality.
The cartridges are moving smoothly through the stations. Keep a watchful eye on the far left line. Precision is paramount. Verified and approved.
A simple symbol, but a powerful signal. Customers once again had a way to distinguish trusted products from untrusted ones. Even the language changed. Video game console carried the scars of the crash. So Nintendo presented the NES as an entertainment system. By 1988, Nintendo controlled roughly 70% of the American market. The ecosystem had recovered, reorganized around a different apex species. In nature, extinction events rarely erase what came before. They leave lessons behind, and those lessons shape the species that follow. In nature, extinction is rarely absolute. Even after catastrophic population collapses, small groups sometimes endure. Their territory shrinks, their influence fades, yet they persist. The ecosystem moves on, but they remain. By the mid-1980s, Atari was no longer the dominant force that had once shaped the entire video game habitat. The crash had altered the landscape. Nintendo had become the new apex species. Consumers returned. Retailers returned. Developers returned. But the rules governing survival were now entirely different. The environment Atari helped create no longer belonged to Atari. Still, the species is not gone. After the sale of Atari's consumer division in 1984, Jack Tramiel steered the organism toward a different ecological niche. Instead of competing for dominance in home consoles, Atari shifted toward personal computers. The Atari ST became the centerpiece of this adaptation. But the era of uncontested dominance was over. The population survived, but only in a fraction of the territory it once controlled. Around it, the digital world continued evolving. New competitors emerged. New technologies appeared. The habitat expanded in directions Atari no longer led. Gradually, Atari became something unexpected, a symbol of an earlier era. The name still carried weight. The signal still triggered recognition. Consumers remembered Pong. They remembered the Atari 2600. They remembered the moment video games first entered their homes. As the years passed, ownership of the Atari name changed repeatedly. The organism survived, but often in altered forms. In 1996, Atari merged with JTS, a disk drive manufacturer, a sign of how dramatically its position had changed. A species that once dominated its habitat was now being absorbed into another organism entirely. 2 years later, in 1998, the Atari name was sold to Hasbro for $5 million. A company that once generated billions was now reduced to a recognizable signal, detached from the ecosystem it once ruled. But Atari continued changing hands, changing form, adapting, surviving. Then something unexpected happened. Signs of stabilization appeared. By 2025, Atari reported improved financial performance after years of instability. It resumed building and shipping physical products, tangible artifacts rather than rented signals. The scale was smaller, the ambitions more measured, But the effort represented something important: participation. Today, Atari no longer controls the ecosystem. It no longer dictates industry standards. It no longer commands 80% of the market. Those days are gone. Yet its influence remains everywhere. The cartridge model that transformed home gaming, the rise of third-party developers, the lessons that shaped Nintendo's quality controls, the blueprint for modern console systems, all carry traces of Atari's genetic legacy. Some species become important not because they survive forever, but because they change the environment around them. Long after they decline, their influence remains embedded in the habitat itself. The company that once buried cartridges beneath the desert sands is still here. And perhaps that is the most remarkable part of the story. Not that Atari fell, many apex species do, but that after reshaping an entire ecosystem, it continues searching for a place within it. Everywhere beneath the surface are traces of the organism that arrived first. The pioneer, the apex predator, the cautionary tale. Atari.